Well, the church was seeking an interim pastor to fill in until a new senior pastor was hired. And as one of the associate pastors, I was asked to have lunch with the consistory's choice for the new interim senior pastor before they formally offered him the position. We met for a casual lunch at a fancy restaurant. He told me some of his ministerial background. I shared about my experience at the church and some of the wounds around the departure of the previous pastor. We discussed theological topics. We talked about our families and our hobbies and sports, and it was all pretty standard stuff and a lovely conversation. As we finished our desserts, a server on the far side of the dining room stumbled and dropped a tray of food that they were carrying. There was the explosion of sound as glasses shattered and food scattered and skittered across the floor. And then the dining room fell silent, except for the loud, sarcastic clapping of the man I was having lunch with. I couldn't honestly believe it. If we were in middle school, it still wouldn't have been right, but at least in that context, I would have expected another student to do some of that clapping at the child who had dropped their tray. But here, though, at our casual lunch at a fancy restaurant, I was stunned. And then horrified to be sitting at the table with him. That evening, the consistory president asked me how lunch went. We had a nice conversation, I began. His theology is solid. He had a lot of experiences that I think would be relevant for our church. He tells good stories. And I paused and said, but there was this one thing. There had been more than enough time between lunch and my evening meeting with the consistory president to wonder if maybe I was just blowing all of this out of proportion, to second guess myself. It was only 10 seconds of a 2-hour lunch. 1 hour, 59 minutes, and 50 seconds of it had been fine. And I suspected that a lot of folks in the church would actually enjoy his preaching and his teaching. But those 10 seconds felt like an eternity. We all have moments in our lives where we are deeply vulnerable. For the server, this should have just been a minor moment of vulnerability. Dishes break, there's a flash of embarrassment, and you move on with your job. But instead of allowing that scene to just play out, and for the server to move on with her duties, my table mate decided to prolong their vulnerability, to hold them in that place of embarrassment. Who wants to be around someone like that? Someone who punches down at people who are already vulnerable or are embarrassed or suffering. Someone who pours salt on a wound. We don't like that in our friends. We fear it in our bosses. We avoid those people in social settings. Who'd want that in their pastor? A person who is routinely invited into our most vulnerable moments of life and death. Who would want that? And I knew why he had done this. Everyone in the dining room knew what he was doing. This is why they were staring at our table. He was exploiting that server's vulnerability for his own entertainment. I kind of knew that when consistory heard about this, they weren't going to offer him the position. And they didn't. And when they told him why, reportedly, he said that he was just being funny and joking, and I was too sensitive. And the church probably wasn't a good fit for him anyway because they weren't going to like his humor. Which only confirmed the consistory's decision in their minds. Because we people of faith cannot go around deliberately adding to the pain of the world, particularly for our own entertainment. Which I would like to think kind of goes without saying, right? That as people of faith, we do not strive to add to the pain of the world. It kind of goes without saying. And yet, bullying and abusing and mocking and laughing at people who are just doing their jobs or living their lives or struggling or vulnerable, it should go without saying, but it apparently needs to be said periodically. Because, friends, there is enough pain and suffering in the world as it is without supposedly religious people piling on to it. Today's readings speak to this commonality of suffering and embarrassment and struggle in the world. In Lamentations, which Paul read for us, we hear this deep and visceral cry of the refugee and the defeated and the grieving. In Luke, we hear the apostles' vulnerable plea to increase our faith, because their experiences with those whom society had held up as good religious people had only added to their sense of discomfort and vulnerability. Today's stories aren't exactly happy, shiny, uplifting stories. Vulnerability and suffering and grief usually aren't. But instead, they speak to this global reality that suffering is real. Vulnerability lingers, and everyone is either capable of adding to the suffering and clapping at the misfortune of others, or choosing to comfort the vulnerable and befriend the grieving. In the book of Lamentations, it says that the roads themselves were mourning. That the roads themselves were mourning. Nearly 600 years before Jesus' birth, the vibrancy of Israel was enslaved in a foreign land. The roads to Babylon were mourning as the Israelites were marched out of the promised land. It was a horrifying image of the most vulnerable people being led into a time of unimaginable suffering. This past Tuesday at our weekly Bible study, we discussed how this image of the roads mourning still lingers in our culture today. A line of boxcars heading to Auschwitz or Buchenwald. A trail of tears that cuts through the heartland of America. A badly burned child fleeing a Vietnamese village. A mass of refugees running from gangs and warlords as they seek shelter in a new land. The roads themselves are still mourning. And it goes without saying, doesn't it, that Christians don't clap at this distress of the world. We comfort and stand with and listen to and believe them. And we recognize we can't promise that we'll make everything right, but we can at least advocate for what we know is right. The book of Lamentations doesn't make promises it can't keep. There's no, it'll all be fine in the morning. There's no, we'll fix it for you. Instead, the author of the poetry just acknowledges the truth of the suffering and then promises to stand with these vulnerable people and shower them with God's love, no matter what comes. In Luke, the apostles cry out that they need more faith. They didn't really need a second serving of faith, or to pray more, to go to church more often, or whatever. As Charles Cussar puts it in Luke's gospel, faith is always related to God and God's actions through Jesus. And so it's not so much what humans do or don't do, but what the limitless power of God does through us. Faith is simply openness to the power of God. So they cry for more faith, and Jesus reminds them that just this little opening, just a tiny grain of faith, just a mustard seed worth of faith, is sufficient for God to work through them in order to relieve the suffering of the world. Well, today is World Communion Sunday. We do this every year as we recognize our unity with our global Christian brothers and sisters. And every few years, the readings are designed to remind us that everyone, all of us, all people throughout the world, know what it is like to suffer, to struggle, to be vulnerable. We all experience those times where we are deeply, deeply vulnerable. And even when we ourselves are not in one of those times, we are well aware of friends and neighbors and a global community that is suffering. To which Lamentations doesn't offer any cheap fixes or easy fake promises. It just joins in the reality of the world and encourages us to stand with the vulnerable and bring God's love to those who are suffering. Which feels, if not at least overwhelming, it might feel even totally impossible to reach out to the needs of the world. And yet Jesus then turns around and reminds us that we don't need anything more to do exactly this. We just need a tiny mustard seed of faith, a small act of solidarity, a touch of grace through which God will work. A touch of grace, which might be as small and simple as helping someone pick up their tray, collect the spilled items, and move on with their day. Amen.